first, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me and for this interview. And I think I want to start where you started. I think what I always have appreciated as a first-generation Haitian American, I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, grew up in Dix Hills, Long Island, but had parents that instilled everything that was positive in me was connected to my Haitianness. And you know, when I look at this appointment, it's not about me. You're absolutely right. But this is really about my parents' sacrifices and me being the beneficiary, the great beneficiary of that. And so this is, it's really, for all the sacrifices that they've made and the joy and the pleasure that they felt when I was appointed, and understanding that it's not about myself, understanding it's about the community as a whole, is something that I've always been guided by. Oftentimes people would say, where's a girl from Cleveland, Ohio, how can she be this passionate about being Haitian? And I think a lot of that is attributed to my parents, whether it's the music, the culture, the food, even growing up in a community where there weren't that many black people, let alone Haitians, but to have that was extremely important, and I'm so grateful. One thing, you know, anyone will never say about me is that I'm an undercover Haitian. It's in everything about me. I try to put that forward because I also want to create a better understanding of the Haitian community through the work that I've been able to do. One of the things is I actually thought I was going to be a musician. At a very young age, my parents will tell you that I was a very animated child and really loved to sing and to dance. And my parents immersed me in the arts and music, but still, as you know, with Haitians, reinforcing the need for an education. I'm a classically trained opera singer and started studying when I was 10 years old. And really went through junior high school and high school, and really as I was applying to college, thinking that this was going to be my career. But there was always another side of me also, a passion for communities, a passion for working with people in the communities. And my dad always tells a story about when I was 8 years old and in Queens and seeing litter and stuff being strewn about in the neighborhood and wanting to organize the neighborhood to do a cleanup day. And I think for my parents that was a first inkling of in addition to having this passion around the arts and music, seeing something else in me in terms of service. And also as Haitians, as I say, politics is in our blood. I think it's in the DNA. So I was always very interested in politics, both on the local level and on the national level. And while most kids may have been watching cartoons, I was like watching the McLaughlin Group or Meet the Press or things of that nature. So when I applied to Tufts University, I went in there really with the thought that I was going to get the education, because I knew with Haitian parents not having it would be not acceptable, and understanding that my education was a foundation. And I think that's something that's extremely valuable about the Haitian community, is that education is really a driving force in the community. When I went to college in the early 80s, at that time, the big issue was divestment in South Africa. And I became very, very active around that issue, very active around student government. And really, what I credit my time at Tufts University was really sort of bringing out that side of me in terms of my passion around service, around addressing injustice, around working with people that don't have access to the justice system. And by the time I graduated, I was accepted into law school, and really the music side of me sort of drifted away, and went to Case Western Reserve School of Law, which is where I was born. So it was circling back to Cleveland, and that was a great experience. And my focus there was really on public interest law and wanting to work on how I can be a very strong. What I really credit my parents for is really instilling in me, think of it, here you have two Haitians that come to the United States in the early 60s. They have a child, a young black woman, in the middle of the civil rights movement. And what I really credit my parents for, and particularly my dad, my mom did this by example, but my father, instilling in me that I could be anything that I wanted to be. And that, I think it was an opportunity to pursue their medical career. So my mom is a nurse and my father is a doctor. So they were also trailblazers themselves. So my father, for example, was the first black chief resident in surgery at a local hospital in Cleveland, Ohio. So I think it was about what many people come to America for, which was opportunities. And so there was never that conversation around politics. It was really about empowering their child. And empowering them and giving them the tools to compete in society. One way in terms of doing that was education, but the other one was instilling that confidence that if you want to be an opera singer, we support you in being an opera singer. You want to now go into law, we are going to support you wholeheartedly. You want to pursue a career in public interest, we're going to support you. If you want to go and become a deputy borough president, we got you 100%. And I'm really thankful to have parents that instill that confidence in me, and knowing that and understanding my history as a Haitian, I think really drove that as well. I picked social justice, and I think that is helping people that don't have access to be able to take tools and resources that have been given to you and to share them with individuals that don't have access to that, to me, is an incredible experience. To be able to serve individuals, to give them access to the civil legal justice system, to the criminal justice system, to me was extremely important. To be into communities, to do community grassroots work and organizing work. So I never went into law because I wanted to make tons of money. I was guided into the law because I was passionate about service, passionate about communities, passionate about people that I saw around me that were not getting justice.
Yeah, when you start, at the Queen's Legal Services, our life was for, especially, for the women at that time.
It was, look, it's not where we are now. Certainly, I think issues such as domestic violence for a very long time were really issues that were talked about very quietly. These issues were considered a family matter. Certainly for women, really developing resources where women who were experiencing domestic violence, where they could go. So this was really the cusp of the anti-violence movement really gaining force and steam in New York State. If you remember, at that time also was the O.J. Simpson trial. And while many people do not describe that case as a domestic violence case, I actually do. But as a result of that, there were a number of pieces of legislation that went through in New York State to help address the needs of victims of domestic violence. And so that led to many different kinds of reforms, funding being put in place for programming, whether it's legal services, social services programs. So it was a pivotal time, and I felt very fortunate to be able to be a part of the advocacy community working on that issue. Well, I think social justice, when you really carve out the different buckets around social justice, at the first, you have to deal with community. You have to be on the ground. You have to understand how certain things within the community are being experienced by others differently. once you have an understanding about that, you need to organize community. You need to bring stakeholders together to figure out how do we best tackle this issue. And oftentimes that could be around a legislative or a policy framework. So to me, they're all interrelated. What I do, for example, as a commissioner, many of it is under the auspices of the Office to Combat Domestic Violence. A lot of it is community-based work, community awareness, working with different constituencies, whether it be clergy, community-based providers, educators, law enforcement, but we're also responsible for looking at more globally, citywide, the delivery of services to victims of domestic violence, working with other agencies like the Department of Health, the New York City Housing Authority, the New York City Police Department. And the other piece of the work that I do as a commissioner for OCDV is around legislative proposals. You really get all of that to look at these issues more globally. So we're looking at service delivery, we're looking at policy, and we're looking at legislation.
And what's the most difficult or challenging thing, to do in the kind of work you are doing?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. One, really creating awareness in communities about what's happening and why this is such an important issue. As I said earlier, many people don't want to talk about domestic violence. They'd rather talk about anything else but domestic violence. But when you look at, in the aggregate, what domestic violence is doing to communities, it has a disproportionate impact. So it's not just the one woman or the man who may be a victim of domestic violence. You're looking at an entire family. You're looking at, if there's a domestic violence case, there could be intervention by what we would call child protective services. It can destabilize a neighborhood. So it is important to create that awareness. It's important to let people know what resources are out there. It's important to also be able to advocate with governmental agencies, with the legislature, why we need certain policy reforms, why we need funding around certain initiatives in order to provide what we call a safety net for victims of domestic violence. So it is really understanding how do you create the framework that creates a better understanding around this issue, because I think oftentimes the understanding of domestic violence is really one-dimensional. So they think it's just a black eye, but people don't understand. It could be financial abuse, it could be psychological abuse, it could be emotional abuse. And if we understand more comprehensively what domestic violence is and understand the needs of people that are experiencing domestic violence, that requires us to figure out in a service delivery, legislatively, in terms of resources that are available, whether it's our family justice centers, for example, here in New York City, which provide wraparound services for victims of domestic violence. Because oftentimes, if you talk to victims, what you will hear is that they're afraid, they're alone, they've experienced trauma, they may not know where to go. So being able to provide that information to me is extremely helpful. Also, working with different agencies that are supporting the work of victims of domestic violence, also letting them know that we are here and to work with them in a more collaborative way. So I think getting out, talking to people, being out in the community, working with government agencies, elected officials is really a holistic way of addressing the issue of domestic violence. I mean, this is really traced to how women have been viewed worldwide. So when you're looking at patriarchal societies, we know that, for example, and ecclesiastical law, we know that there was a sense or really sort of a law that when a woman married a man, that her identity merged into that of her spouse, or that women being seen as chattel. And I'm using women not to say that domestic violence does not hit across all neighborhoods, ethnicities, gender, and regardless of socioeconomic status. But
the statistics are what they are.
Correct. By and large, it's disproportionately women based upon the reported. So when we're looking at patriarchal societies, ecclesiastical law, looking at this chattel rule, even this comment, what a lot of people don't understand, the saying rule of thumb. Rule of thumb was really a standard that was used by the courts in assault cases to determine if you used, for example, a switch that was no bigger than your thumb, that would be a guiding principle for the courts as to determining assault cases. So there are a number of things throughout history that have really supported the subjugation of women. And that's not just limited to the Caribbean. You could look here in the United States. You can look into other continents around the world. And I think as part of movements around social justice, similar to what has happened in terms of civil rights, what's happened in terms of women's rights, we all have the right, regardless of your gender, your race, your socioeconomic background, to be free of violence of any form, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's child abuse, sexual assault, or trafficking.
Now, to get directly to your new position,
yes,
what will be in the next year, next 2 years, your priorities?
So right now, what I'm really doing, this is week 6 for me. So I am really focused on this first quarter into getting out and talking to communities, learning about needs. So for example, going out to, we have 59 community boards, local planning boards here in New York City. I'm going to go to all of them. We have community precinct council meetings. I'm going to try to get to all of those meetings. There are other community meetings that I want to get to. I want to go to churches. I want to go to synagogues. I want to go to mosques because I, want to introduce myself, which I think is important to do. One, let them know about what our agency does and the resources that we have available, but more importantly, extend the invitation and express the desire to want to partner with them to understand what's happening in their neighborhood as it relates to domestic violence. So one of the things we're developing for each of our local districts here, based on council districts, we're creating snapshots in terms of domestic violence. So in your neighborhood, you know exactly what's happening in terms of domestic violence. And I think it helps create better awareness about this issue, because I think a lot of people sometimes think domestic violence happens over there in those neighborhoods, but not in my neighborhood, or it happens to those people, or it happens to poor people, or it happens to certain constituencies or ethnicities. And I think we want to dispel that and understand that domestic violence touches every neighborhood in the city, every area throughout the state, and certainly throughout the United States. So I also want to help create a better understanding about the resources, because we have invested so much, both on the community level and on the government level, around resources. So that's really my first quarter. Then really looking at some of the legislative and policy agenda items that we may want to focus on. So housing is permanent housing is an issue, certainly. We are rolling out a new family justice center in Manhattan, which provides the wraparound services. So making sure that in the borough of Manhattan, people know what's happening in terms of wraparound services. We are going to be, our final family justice center is going to be in Staten Island, which we will begin construction hopefully soon. But in planning that, that's a very long planning process, and doing our work in that regard. So I think it's really the community outreach, establishing a legislative agenda, and understanding, once you've identified those priorities, sort of who you need to sit down with, who do you need to advocate with in order to move those ideas and proposals forward.
And in that sense, how do you plan to engage the youth, the adolescents in
I want to relate that back to prevention. One of the things that we're seeing related to domestic violence is that for our young people, they are fed a steady diet of violence, whether it's video games, whether it's television, whether it's movies, and whether it's music also, which can be extremely misogynistic. And so there are programs that work with high school students and middle school students. I think that's too late, actually. I think we need to be looking at models to bring curriculums for K through 12. I know for myself, by the time I was in college, I thought I was grown. And so you've already formed your opinions around issues. So to the extent that we can begin talking to young people as young as kindergarten about this, because remember, children model behavior. And children that witness domestic violence, there's a high percentage that either that child may become a victim of domestic violence or may become an abuser. And so we want to be able to train school personnel, school safety personnel, the guidance counselors, everyone working with children, leaders of youth-based organizations and their staff around domestic violence, because oftentimes what we think is a behavioral issue or that person is hyperactive, what you may diagnose or think that child, could be that the child is acting out or just modeling behavior that they've seen come in the home. So we want to be able to train people so that they have an understanding on how best to, once that's identified, what kind of services need to be in place that may be able to help us to intervene early on to see what's happening in the household.
A lot to do, but talking about your priorities, where the money will be coming from? What staff do you have to implement those priorities?
Well, we have a staff of 40, and we have through our family justice centers, we have staff and work with community-based partners that also provide staffing on site at our family justice centers and also off-site as part of our family justice centers. We have a central staff also here that works on more globally across the agency, our outreach issues. But one of the things that we have been able to do as an agency historically is leverage public-private partnerships. So we do receive funding from government, from the mayor's office, but also in order to develop our family justice centers, which costs, for example, millions of dollars, we've been able to leverage resources from the city council, our local elected officials who can commit dollars for sort of capital funding, brick and mortar type of initiatives. But the biggest challenge is really leveraging resources for programmatic initiatives. So we run a healthy teen dating academy, and we have peer educators. So how do you fund that? Who are the institutions that you can go to that can help support programming like this? Certainly community outreach materials that you give out that whether it's a little keychain, whether it's flyers, all of this costs money. So how do you form strategic partnerships with entities and corporations and private foundations that support this issue, want to do more around this issue? So,
how do you plan, to use the social media mostly to educate, the youth around domestic violence?
I think technology is extremely important and something that just generally in terms of our work is just part of our work now, right? I always say everything now has a communication strategy if you're really trying to get your message out, and social media is a part of that. And so we'd like to use social media as a way not only to engage young people, but also to engage the community across the board about the work that we're doing as an agency, once again about programs that we may have to spread the word about that, but also to let them know about resources, because whether we recognize it or not, when you really start talking to people, we all know someone who's either been a victim of domestic violence or knows someone within their family that has experienced domestic violence.
MCTV, Multicultural Television Network, canal 283 sous Comcast. Oui, li possible et nous voulons faire ensemble avec vous. Chaîne déjà disponible, MCTV, canal 283 Concas, staff technique là sous place, équipement dernier cri installé. MCTV couvrit toute Massachusetts. Sauti Lynn pour arriver Bridgewater, en passant par Somerville, Cambridge, Medford, Everett, Malden, Boston, Waltham, Dedham, Milton, Quincy, Randolph, Stoughton, Sharon, Vermont, Rockland, Brockton. Une opportunité pour nous produire propre émission panneau, live ou en différé. Surtout avec assistance technique, une équipe professionnelle chevronnée pour aider nous produire des émissions de qualité. Studio MCTV localisé dans Randolph, 247 North Main Street, Harbor One Bank Building, téléphone 781 986 1000. Prix abordable. Pour information, relais Yves Cajuste 781 986 000 ou bien 508 498 02 00 ou bien encore Julio Midi 617 470 19 12. Nous invitons tout haïtien garder MCTV canal 283 Comcast dans l'émission Caméra Mosaïque préparée par Yves Cajuste samedi et dimanche soir 8h-10h dans la région métropolitaine Boston. Et pour même dans la zone métro sud, Brockton, Randolph, Milton, Waltham, Dedham, émission pour la vie nous chaque dimanche de 8h à 9h du soir.